It was on the eve of D-Day, there in 1944, that General Eisenhower was writing in his diary, his journal that night. And he talked about how he couldn't sleep the night before the invasion of Normandy. And he wrote in his diary that, if the operation ended up being a failure in any way, that he wanted the failure to rest solely on him. And I can imagine, and you can probably imagine, what that sleepless night must have been like for Eisenhower as he contemplated the operation that was about to take place, as he contemplated the results, whether it be an incredible success or a colossal failure. I even wonder if he had a notion as to how seismic an event that would end up becoming, how world-changing that invasion was. I thought about all of that because in the text that we have today, in Esther chapter 6, we read about another leader, a king, not a general. We read about another leader who couldn't sleep one night, and the effects were momentous, and I would say again, even world-changing, history-changing because of it. So in Esther chapter 6, we find that Xerxes has gone home from the first banquet that Esther has thrown. Remember last week we looked at how Haman had gone home and talked all about how lucky he was and how fortunate he was and how incredibly powerful he was, and he's got a great wife and great sons and great everything. Yeah, but when he was coming home from the banquet, a huge honor to be invited to dine with just the king and the queen and nobody else but himself. He comes home and he sees Mordecai, and he's reminded of the pebble that Mordecai is in his shoe, the burr in his saddle, the hitch in his giddy-up, and he just can't stand it. I mean, he is so miserably unhappy because one guy won't kiss up to him and bow when he walks by. It eats at him. It eats at him. On that same night, Xerxes, as it turns out, couldn't sleep. And we find out why, as we read further, that what seems like just a random night of insomnia wasn't random at all. Because even though he's never named, God's fingerprints are all over this particular story. We're going to start in Esther chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. That night, the king could not sleep, and so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Remember, we were told about this conspiracy and Mordecai basically raising the warning to Esther, and Esther passed it on to Xerxes. But we read about this at the end of chapter 2. And the narrator tells us that nothing was done to reward Mordecai's faithfulness or goodwill, his good deed in alerting the king to this assassination attempt. Even though the perpetrators were found and executed, nothing's done to reward Mordecai for this act of honor. And yet, on the night that the king can't sleep, it just so happens that in the big book of records for the entire kingdom, the scribe turns to this page and to this event. Now, I want you to ask yourself, do you really think that that was coincidence? Or do you think it was the providence of God at work? I think we know the answer. Continuing with the story, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. And the king said, who is in the court? And now Haman had just entered the court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole that he had set up for him. So Haman's walked in, and he's got an agenda. Right? He's got something he wants to ask the king to do. Because that same night, as we read at the end of chapter 5, his wife and friends had said, you know what you can do about Mordecai? You can build a great big pole. Some translations say a gallows, but we talked about that last week. That most likely Mordecai that Haman intends to crucify him or impale him on a stake as opposed to hanging him from a rope, based on, at least on Persian history and tradition. But he walks in and he finds that the king has not been able to sleep. And again, we might be tempted to think of this as coincidence. I love the fact that when the text says that the king could not sleep, the Hebrew actually says that sleep of the king had fled. And it's almost as if this sleep has fled from Xerxes like a thief in the night. Okay? I don't know that this is just a random evening of insomnia. He can't sleep. And so he basically orders for these chronicles to come forward and be read to him. And these were Persian bedtime stories, right? I mean, if anything will put you to sleep, it's the dry, day-to-day record of things that have gone on in the kingdom. He wasn't calling these in to be read to him to be entertained. He was trying to make himself drowsy again. I know many times when I'm not able to sleep, I just listen to recordings of my old sermons. Go out like that, My dad actually, when he was preaching, young couples at church, when they had a baby, he would take an audio tape of one of his sermons and give it to them to help the baby sleep through the night. Don't know if that ever worked or not, but that's what he would try to do. I also want you to think about what we discussed when we talked about Esther chapter 1. And in that chapter, there's a big to-do made about how Xerxes is rich and he is powerful. Xerxes is rich and Xerxes is powerful. Can y'all say that with me? Xerxes is rich and Xerxes is powerful. And at the end of the chapter, he can't even get his own queen to do what he wants him to do. And his advisors manipulating him into issuing just a terrible decree. We find that Xerxes is manipulated on several occasions. And here, the most powerful man in the world, with the most powerful military in the world, he can't get his own eyelids to do what he wants them to do. Xerxes is presented as someone that doesn't have nearly as much control over things as he might like to think. But they bring this book forward, they read about this, and again, you can't think that this is just coincidence, that the page just happens to turn to the one where Mordecai had saved the king's life. We see that God's fingerprints are all over this, and it's a good reminder that our sovereign God never, ever, ever sleeps. And he doesn't have to shout to get a man's attention. He just has to keep him awake. That's what we see in this particular passage. But then we start to see this reversal take shape when Haman comes into the palace. And so we find here that he had just entered and he's going to ask about Mordecai's execution. But his attendants answered to the king, Haman is standing in the court. Well, bring him in, the king ordered. Again, I don't think this is just circumstantial. I don't think that this is just a random twist of fate. Because Haman enters into the king, and the king asks him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king could rather honor than me? So he answered to the king, for the man the king delights to honor, here's what he should do. Verse 8, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. And then what you need to do is let that robe and the horse be entrusted to the one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and let him and lead him on the horse through the streets, proclaiming the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done to the man that the king delights to honor. Now Haman, first of all, is clearly thinking about himself. I mean, who on Xerxes' radar screen would he want to do this for but me? You're so vain. You think this question's about you, right? What's intriguing to me is that we know from history that this was actually commonly done by Persian kings for people they wanted to honor. They would dress them up in a robe that the king had worn. They would put him on the king's horse, and they would parade him through the streets of Susa, through the courtyard of the city. This was commonly done. And so it's not a stretch at all that this would be happening for Mordecai, or for Haman to think it's happening for him on this particular occasion. Notice how it continues in verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for yourself. Are the words I'm sure Haman heard initially, when in fact Xerxes had said, do this for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have commanded. What? You're kidding me, right? This is a joke, right? Am I on candid camera? Imagine what must have run through Haman's mind. I mean, the reversal here, the irony here is staggering. He literally walks into the throne room to ask for Mordecai's death sentence. And he walks out commanded by the king to go all out in honoring Mordecai. And Haman is the one who has to lead the parade. Haman is the one who has to lead Mordecai on the king's horse through the streets, telling everybody, this is what happens to the man the king wishes to honor. I mean, Haman has to think of all the rotten luck. I can't win. Verse 11. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And I'm sure it came out, this is what is done for the man that the king delights to honor. I mean, choking on every single word. This is what Haman has to do. And afterward, Mordecai gloated to Haman and all his friends. Nope. He just goes right back to his job, returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. This is just the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. Oh, buddy, don't go to dinner. As we'll see next week. Haman's beside himself with grief. Haman is devastated. And it's not that hard to believe when you realize what pride will do to a person. It's not that hard to understand. It's not that hard to believe when you recognize just how poisoned Haman has become by the fact that he's inflated with his own sense and worth of himself. This is just the worst thing that could have ever happened to him in his mind. But what's intriguing to me is the response that he receives from his wife when he returns home to get ready for the banquet. And he told Zeresh, his wife and all his friends, everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Now, I find this fascinating. That the night prior, his wife and his friends were telling him, kill the Jew. Just impale him on a big pole. 75-foot pole. I mean, make sure everybody knows you've killed him for his insolence and his evil and his wickedness. He's just a foul person. And make sure everyone in the empire knows it. And 24 hours later, you don't want to do anything to this guy. It's if this were translated in a Michael Whitworth paraphrase inspired version translation, it would be, buddy, you're cooked. You're in so much trouble. This is not going to end well for you. And I want you to pause for a moment and think, how is this not a last gesture of grace by God to Haman. Because despite what they say, he has not yet passed the point of no return. Because just as they say this, we find in the last verse that while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet that Esther had prepared. He will not return home at all. But between the moment that they first said these words to Haman and the moment that he sat down to eat at Esther's banquet, there was nothing preventing him from taking the king aside and saying, "Hey, I need to have a real quick talk with you. Here's what I've done. It was wrong of me. I am sorry. And first thing tomorrow morning, I want to work on a plan to undo this and try to put the toothpaste back in the tube as much as is possible." For whatever reason, Haman doesn't do that. And at least from my perspective, I think I know why. From a human willpower standpoint, it's impossible. And I know with God, all things are possible, but from a human willpower standpoint, that once you've reached this level of self-deception, once you've reached this level of arrogance, the moment that you've become so blinded by pride, humility rips the blindfold off, and it's often too late to do anything about it. Again, with God, all things are possible. I don't think that it was literally impossible for Haman to have stopped things in their tracks. But when, from a human willpower standpoint, you are that inflated with yourself and have so much hatred for other people, it's nearly impossible to stop yourself. I think he had the opportunity, but it was a bad bet to think he could pull it off. As soon as those words were out of the mouth of his wife and his friends, he's whisked away. Did he have any recognition what was about to happen to him? Did he have any semblance of, they don't know what they're talking about? Did he completely dismiss their warning out of hand? We really don't know. His behavior at the feast, however, suggests to me that Esther's revelation caught him completely off guard. We'll talk about that next week. But as we reflect on this story, I want us to recognize that there are three main truths that are intended to give us comfort in these verses. Number one, in times of life when you can't sleep, you can rest assured that God is not sleeping either. Psalm 121 talks about how that the God of Israel does not slumber and he does not sleep. God is not asleep at the wheel of your life, even though it may feel like it sometimes. God is constantly working everything for our good and his glory. There's that temptation that we all have when things aren't going as we think they ought to be, to hit the panic button, to think that God is distracted, or worse, that God has abandoned us. God has thrown us out to the lions to fend for ourselves, and we need to take charge and we need to take control, and if I don't act, it's not going to happen. And that lack of faith, that abandonment of our values that so often happens in those moments, almost always ends up making the situation worse, doesn't it? When we can't sleep about things in life, we can rest assured that God isn't sleeping either. But he's always working. He's also already working for our good and his glory. Number two, when evil seems to be running around unchecked, just doing whatever it pleases, we need to remember Haman and recognize that no, evil is not running loose without a leash, but rather God's sovereign will is reigning over it. The moment that Haman seems to be unstoppable, the moment that Mordecai's death seems to be a foregone conclusion. I mean, I hate to put it in these terms in a sermon, but think about it. If Vegas were taking odds on Mordecai's death, as Haman is walking into the throne room, the beginning of this chapter, pretty good odds he's dying. No one sees this coming. But God knew it was coming because God was the one orchestrating it. And in times in life when we are suffering injustice or we're looking at wickedness in the world and wondering, when is it going to end? Recognize that human evil and human foolishness and human stupidity has always been on the leash of God's sovereignty. It's not running amok in the world. But number 3, and finally this morning, when you feel like you have been forgotten about, you need to remember Mordecai. We're not told how many times Mordecai grumbled to himself that, I did a good deed and now my people are going to be exterminated for it. I did a good deed and I didn't even get a thank you card in the mail. Not even a Candygram, not even a DoorDash gift card, nothing. No acknowledgement whatsoever. Given Mordecai's character, I doubt that happened too often. But I know how I would have reacted, and I would have been really put out. I'd never said anything, but I'd have been really put out. I mean, how rude for the king not to do something. Rig it so that I win my fantasy football league this year. Something from the king to show, hey, attaboy, thank you. There are times in life you're going to feel like you are forgotten by anyone and everyone who matters. You'll think back about how faithful you've been, how obedient you've been, how much of a servant you've been with no recognition whatsoever. And I can promise you, you will get recognition one day. And it will be from the only person that matters, right? Just because no one else on this earth has seen your service, your good deeds, your faithfulness, your obedience, doesn't mean that our Heavenly Father is blind to it also. God knows all. He sees all. Nothing is hidden from His sight. Hebrews 4 and verse 13. And as a result, we can take comfort in the fact that one day God will recognize. And just because nothing has happened yet doesn't mean that something won't happen eventually. Because the older I get, the more and more I study, and the more and more I reflect on life, I recognize that things happen in the perfect timing of God's will. Not a moment sooner, not a moment later. We have to trust the Lord that He knows what we're doing, and we decidedly, most often, do not. As is often the case in the Christian life, it comes down to faith and how much we're willing to trust that God has our good at heart, and He's working everything for our good and His own glory. We'll see how the story progresses next week in Esther chapter 7. But as we close this morning, I want to ask you, maybe you're here and you're not a Christian. What's keeping you from putting your Lord on in faith, repentance, and baptism this morning so that you can leave here as a child of God? For many more of you, maybe you're here and you are a Christian, and yet you know that there are some changes that you need to make in your life before it is eternally too late. If you have a need to respond this morning for any reason, we want you to come. As together we stand and sing this song.